James Gross, who among his many achievements is, along with me and the son of Professor Shulman, a member of the Yale class of 1987, is himself somebody who brings together the humanities and the sciences. At Yale, he was an undergraduate major in philosophy and psychology, went on to Stanford, where he is now a professor in the psychology department there, and has done some of the most important work in framing how it is that we should understand emotion regulation. I had the great pleasure of meeting James and Angela about 5 years ago at a conference that I co-organized with Hedy Kober, a professor here at the medical school, and in those 5 years have had the chance to learn from their work. And it seemed to me when I was given the opportunity to conduct the Shulman seminar that there was no greater way to repay Professor Shulman for his inspiration than to bring speakers like James and Angela before us as a Yale to talk about their work. So, great welcome to Angela and James. Thank you.
Thank you, Tamar, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you to both you and Paul for selecting Angela and me as part of your speaker series. It's an honor to be here and a pleasure to speak with you tonight. Our focus, as our title suggests tonight, will be self-control. And I'd like to begin just getting a pulse of the nation by asking, how many of you have ever experienced a temptation that led you to need to exercise self-control? Is there anyone who would admit to this? Marcia, not? But okay, yes, slowly, after at the end, with prompting. Yes, thank you. Good, so welcome to the human condition. A fundamental part, I think, of being human is navigating the temptations that we experience. Now I'd like to, again, by way of introduction and getting a sense of you, to think not just of the struggles you may have had, but think of loved ones, other people in your family, friends. What are the kinds of things that have led you or another person to want to exercise self-control? What are the contexts in which you've tried to engage or someone else has tried to engage self-control? What comes to mind? Anybody? Food? What else? Exercise. Anything else? Drink? Food, drink, exercise? Work. What else? Anger. Great. So this is just a small sampling, and if I gave you another minute or two, you would, I'm sure, say more. But these are the things that we're interested in thinking together about self-control. And the definition that we'll be using tonight that I think integrates across the instances that you've just called to mind is this one. Self-control, from our point of view, for tonight at least, can be defined as the self-initiated regulation of conflicting impulses in the service of enduringly valued goals. I'm going to try to unpack that a little bit for you guys, thinking about the things that you call to mind. So there are two, I think, key features here that we're going to really have us all together pay attention to. The first is that when we're talking about self-control, we're talking about self-initiated action, as opposed to initiated action that's initiated by a loved one who prompts you, a parent who, pushes you, whoever it is. This falls outside our focus tonight. So self-initiated action. The second thing that we'd like to key in on is this asymmetric conflict. So when we're thinking about self-control tonight, we'll be thinking about a context in which a less valued goal, temptation, is more rewarding in the moment, but there's another thing that's lurking on the mental horizon, something that's a more valued goal that's going to be more rewarding in the long term. Okay, so that's what we mean when we try to address the kinds of things that you've brought to our attention by way of your examples. So self-control. And we, I think, are going to be aiming this talk in a fairly general way, with apologies to people who are probably more expert than we are in this area. But at times, I think we'll jump into some of the details, with apologies to those of you who don't care about the details. So we'll try to get that balance right. I want to say just, again, by way of introduction, that the way I came to this, as Tamar intimated, is via an interest in what might be thought of as a special case of self-control, special context in which, as one example would have us think, we're trying to manage not hunger, not drinking, not exercise, but emotions. And so my research program is actually very focused on this special instance of self-control in which we are motivated. We're not always motivated, but in instances we are motivated to manage or modify the emotions that we have, negative or positive, trying to increase or decrease those emotions in service of some longer-term goal. And my motivation in focusing in this type of self-control is in part driven by my training as a clinical psychologist. So I'm very interested in normal variation and then the extremes where people get into so much difficulty with emotions like sadness or anxiety that they actually have clinical conditions that interfere with their ability to love and to work. So that's my point of entry. In this talk, we're trying something that we've never really done before, and we'll see how it goes. We're going to trade off occasionally. And so we're literally going to trade off.
Just throw me the, thank you so much. Yeah, I feel like I'm like one of those potato sack races where it's very hard to actually be in the same sack. And I will say that
nice as your sack partner is.
Nice as my sack partner is, and in fact, I should just reiterate thanks to Tamar and Hetty because we met here at Yale. Were it not for the self-regulation conference held here, I think it was November 2011, we wouldn't be here today. So how did I get into this? I was trying to save the American education system one math student at a time. I was a middle school math teacher. I worked in the New York City public schools, the San Francisco public schools, and then finally the Philadelphia public schools. And after struggling to teach kids who are going through puberty and frankly a lot of other things that are very hard, how to get X all by itself, it dawned on me, actually it dawned on me probably day 3 of teaching, that one of the major determinants of whether these kids were going to get algebra or in fact get anything in the classroom and get on in life with any success, that one of the crucial determinants of that would not be their intellectual capacity or their abstract reasoning, but in fact self-control. I don't know that I had the words. I certainly didn't have a very long and wordy definition with 2 crucial features, but I had a very strong intuition that the kids who were sitting in front of me very often, in fact, were giving in to temptation. And in fact, it was a rational choice in the sense that it made them feel good. But the problem was this myopic time horizon that, soon enough, sometimes just 10 minutes later, they would regret what they had done or what they had failed to do, and that was getting them into trouble, not only in my math class, but I could tell from what I could see the rest of their middle school lives, and I had the sense that this would get them into trouble long after I would know them, long after they had left my middle school classroom. So I came to psychology with a particular interest, a very kind of applied, pragmatic interest in self-control. So we're going to hand off mics, and you're going to let me know when you need this back. The arc of the talk is as follows. We'd like to do 5 things. First, a brief history, a very brief history, an intellectual history of the notion of self-control, both from the philosophical lens and then also psychology. Secondly, and here I'm going to pass the clicker back to James, our emerging theoretical framework for how to put together everything that we know about self-control, and in particular, the many creative ways in which we do battle with our temptation in order to adhere to our longer-term values. Third, we're going to talk about some emerging research findings. Since we only met recently, there isn't much to talk about, but we'd like to tell you what we're finding, particularly in a study of school-age children and a second study in college students. And then finally end with take-home points, and then just a couple of teasers, puzzles, and open questions to seed the conversation towards the end of the hour. So without further ado, a very brief history of self-control can be started at least as early as Plato's Phaedrus. Tamar says it's pronounced Phaedrus. Who knew? Tamar knew. And James agreed, so I was like, okay. So I'll read you this quote from Phaedrus, which gives a metaphorical account for what it might be like to struggle internally with 2 things, each of which you actually desire in some sense, but then trying to adjudicate that conflict. The horse that is on the right, so this is the image of the charioteer and 2 horses. The horse that is on the right, or nobler side, is upright in frame and well-jointed, with a high neck and a regal nose. His coat is white, his eyes are black, and he is a lover of honor with modesty. And he needs no whip, and is guided by verbal commands alone. The other horse is a crooked great jumble of limbs with a short bull neck, a pug nose, black skin, and bloodshot white eyes, companion to wild boasts and indecency. He's shaggy around the ears, deaf as a post, and just barely yields to horsewhip and goad combined. So this is an image of willpower exerted with great force, the charioteer presumably pulling back on the reins of the black horse and urging the white horse to go forward. If you fast forward to the very beginnings of modern psychology and ask, how is self-control conceptualized there? Well, we can look to Freud, for example, who believed that the ability to control impulses was perhaps the developmental milestone that children would need to pass successfully in order to navigate all dimensions of emotional and social life later on. So to quote this, because I love the phrasing here, Freud, the great writer as well as the great psychologist, the ego discovers that it is inevitable to postpone the obtaining of pleasure, to put up with a little unpleasure, and to abandon certain sources of pleasure altogether. I don't know that unpleasure is actually a word, but if ever the 21st century needed a new word, it might be the word unpleasure. And then finally, to bring us to a character that most of us have heard of by now, because he's been on the Colbert Report, among other places, and that is Walter Mischel, who was able to operationalize, to measure that what Freud sort of speculatively and poetically talked about, this ability to delay gratification, to put up with a little unpleasure, to forego certain sources of pleasure altogether. But it was not Freud, but in fact Walter Mischel, then a young psychologist at Stanford, who was able to come up with an experimental paradigm, bring kids into the lab, and study whether and when and how they were able to delay gratification. And I'm going to, in the next piece, show 3 minutes of video from Walter's own experiments with his blessing, we think. We've asked him enough times that we think Walter would bless this particular occasion in which we will show his video. Now, classically, in the famous marshmallow task, of which you've probably heard, classically in this paradigm, 4-year-old children are given a simple choice. Would you like one small pile of your favorite treat, which they've identified in an earlier portion of the experiment? Would you like this little pile, for example, this one marshmallow? Or would you like this larger one, but I have to come back into the room, I have to go get something in the hallway, but I'll be right back. Would you want to wait for the 2 marshmallows, or would you rather have the one right away? That's, by the way, not the test. In a recent study of over 1,000 kids run by the federal government, nearly all 1,000 said, no, I'll wait for the 2 rather than have the one right away. And after repeatedly confirming that that in fact is the choice, the question is, how long will the child wait? Not do you go on a diet, but how well do you stick to it, right? So it's it's sustaining the delay of gratification more than the decision to delay gratification. I'm going to play these 3 minutes of video without much narration, but while I play this video, I want you to look at the kids and see whether you can, after I finish the clip, just raise your hand and tell me the sorts of tricks or strategies that kids might be using in this paradigm in order to successfully wait. These kids, by the way, are a little older than age 4. It turns out that most Stanford parents did not consent for their children to be shown ad nauseum to anonymous audiences forever. But the kids in this study, which was done in a different country, anyway, here we go, without further annotation. Okay, would you like mouse pad, trackpad? Thank you. And it's mostly quiet. So here's a little bell where the girl can bring the experimenter back into the room. She can't wait any longer and wants to take one treat right away. Oh, yeah. future Enron employee, probably. Now, this little girl is interesting. You might tell me afterwards what she's doing. And by the way, I've run this study with 11 and 12-year-olds. They look exactly the same as children this age. Fairly tortuous task to complete. Now, those of you with grandchildren or children may recognize what this little girl is doing, because we don't do much of it in our older years. Can't wait anymore. And by the way, to properly run this experiment, there can be no windows in the room, no books to look at, no working clock, nothing that might give a sense of the passing of time or a distraction. Now, this little boy, I'll just point out to you, quite a curious scientific mind here, but he actually gets up out of his chair a little bit. I just want you to notice this, and moves the bell from where it started to the far corner. And I love ending on this one because as an Asian female, we pretty much know what she's going to do, right? Obviously, delay gratification. But in fact, gender and racial stereotypes do not always hold. And she does not wait. Okay. So I'd love to hear volunteers, those of you who remember kids this age, or in particular, but really anyone, we've all been this age after all, what are some of the things that these kids are doing? And just raise your hand, I'll try to see you. Yeah? Yeah, so the little boy kicking the table, that might have served the function of just distracting himself from this, by the way, excruciatingly boring task to do. Yeah? Anything else? Distraction? Yeah. Particularly maybe the girl who was doing that little pretend play or self-talk. So it seems like there was both self-talk and just pretend, right? Like maybe taking on a role of someone like playing the experimenter. Yeah, it's great. Yeah, here. Giving in just a little bit by Oreo. Oh, you mean the little boy who licked it? Yeah. Oh, by the way, so the little boy who licked it and then cleverly sandwiched the Oreo, I'm sure he's not the first child in humanity to figure out that you could lick the Oreo, and maybe pretend that you didn't eat it. The way you code for delay time in this task, that was very clever, but the moment the child, ingests even just a little bit of and they're told this in advance, if you eat any of it, it's kind of over and you can only have the first small treat, the trial's sort of over. So we would only count the number of seconds to that first bite. Yeah, but that little bit of taste, sort of like, I'm not going to eat all of dessert, but could I just have a bite? Yeah, that is actually, I think, a self-control strategy that many of us try to use. Sometimes not for our better, but yeah. Yeah, here.
They're kind of reducing the risk, moving the bell farther away, trying to make it harder to make the mistake.
Interesting, yeah, so definitely the moving the bell farther away in some way, I think it was an intentional and deliberate move. And maybe one more, yeah? Yes, and maybe in particular the girl who had her back turned. So channeling my inner Walter Mischel, devil get thee behind me, right? So this idea that out of sight is out of mind and therefore we should not pay attention to it. So absolutely, I think all of these things actually are true about the children that we see in just this very simple way of thinking about what Freud really meant by the delaying of pleasure and the foregoing of certain pleasures altogether. But I think what's also striking to me as a scholar who tried to get a handle on this massive literature, and really self-control is by some metrics the largest and the most rapidly growing empirical literature in all of psychology, just trying to figure out how to understand this diverse, almost infinite number of things that people could do and do in order to exert self-control. This is where I think I got a little bit lost, and I think it was just around then that I met Tamar and James. And James is going to walk you through what we're thinking as of a useful, maybe not the only, and maybe not the quote-unquote right framework for it, but a really useful way of organizing these strategies according to their functional role and when they're used. So this is the time where I pass this back, right?
Okay. Yep. Great. Okay, not going that way, this way. Super. So this brings us to the theoretical framework we're using and that we find useful to organize the extraordinarily complex strategies and the very wide range of strategies that people use in everyday life. And the way that we begin to think about this is to observe, as many others have, using a hierarchical framework, goal framework, that when you think about what someone is about, what each of us wants to achieve, it's useful as a first move to make a distinction between fairly high-level abstract goals that we have at the top of any given hierarchy, and then the goals that serve those higher-level goals and on down the chain. Multiplying goals typically as you go down all the way to low-level actions, things, observables that actually take place in the world. Let's take as an example a goal of mine, to be a good dad to my kids. So that would be a high-level goal in this panel. And then within that space, I'm thinking about how I decompose that. One of the things that I might want to do is to be really plugged into my kids' lives. So that might be the leftmost second-level goal. I also want to be emotionally present to my kids. That's, let's say, the middle second-level goal. And I want to model sort of healthy behavior to my kids. That might be the leftmost second-level goal. And each of these, in turn, can be decomposed, right? So if I want to be plugged into my kids' lives, I might want to be plugged into both academic or extracurricular lives, and maybe the academic side of things. And each of those has action entailments. And the key idea here is that each of these actions flows, in part, from goals that are supported by and driven, in fact, by higher-level goals. And so there's a nested hierarchical structure. The other thing to notice, I think, in this scheme to get us started is the idea that there are some goals, let's take this one here, that are doing joint work, that are jointly supporting, let's say, my goal of being emotionally present might lead me to really prioritize asking questions, engaging with the kids. But that goal might also serve to instantiate my wanting to model healthy behavior. So there are going to be some goals that are doing joint work, and similarly some actions that can be serving each of several goals simultaneously. So far, so good. Nothing terribly new here. Carver and Shire, many other people in psychology and outside of psychology have used this sort of framework. The thing to notice from our point of view is that not all goals live in this kind of tidy structure. There are some goals that, as we move through our lives, look like this, more like this. They're activated in a bottom-up fashion rather than a top-down fashion. So as we're moving through our lives happily, we see this gorgeous piece of cake sitting on the side. Now, sometimes that's not a problem to see a gorgeous piece of cake because it's okay for us to eat the cake, and that's not at all in tension with any of these other goals that are important to us, let's say in a given domain. Sometimes these locally active goals are actually quite strong, denoted by this dark line. And again, still not necessarily a problem if there's no tension. What we're interested in is cases, of course, where this lovely piece of chocolate cake that emerges on the side of our kitchen right after breakfast in full view of all the kids promotes this urge, this desperate urge to eat it in front of the kids. And that's in tension with my goal to model healthy eating habits for my kids. Okay, and so there's a tension, and that's the problem. And that's where there's this tension between a longer, sort of more durable good, a goal that's supported by this network of highly valued goals. There's a tension between this on the one hand and then this immediately active, quite strong, but limited duration good that's represented by this other goal. And in circumstances like this, when we're tempted, we may then activate processes that weaken this temporarily active goal and strengthen the longer-term valued goal, with the end product of having this one drop out of sight on the far left. The cake then becomes less attractive, and the goal of eating as I should becomes more dominant. And what we're interested in this, another way of putting what we're interested in this talk, is just this space. What is it exactly that's happening as we have these competing goals, some of which are imbued with value because of their nesting within this hierarchical structure, that tie all the way back to things like you really care about being a good dad, being a good student, being a good partner. And others of which, although they have local force, and they're terribly compelling in the moment, don't derive that long-term value. And so what we would mean to actually have ourselves do is this, even though the other is more dominant. And the question that we have now for you and for conversation is, what are these processes exactly that are happening in this yellow box, this domain of self-control? And what we have found it useful in thinking about this to do is to say, well, let's take a step back and let's think about, for any one of these goal action units, what's exactly happening as a motive gathers strength. And one very simple way of thinking about it is to say that, well, there's a situation, some features of a situation that we attend to, and then appraise or evaluate, trying to determine their goodness or badness, and that activates a response tendency. A simple, generic sort of way of thinking about how impulses get built over time. And then if this response tendency is strong enough, it then activates an action that then may act on the situation, the local world that prompted it. The reason we find this combination of a hierarchical goal framework and this process conception of impulse generation helpful is that it suggests points of intervention, places in which we can intervene in this impulse generative cycle to modify the incipient response, either making it weaker if it's an undesired response or making it stronger if it's a desirable response. So this is an effort to get under the hood and think, well, what are the processes that can be activated in service in that yellow zone when there's a conflict between these two goals in order to strengthen the goal that we'd like to have stronger and weaken the goal that we'd like to have weaker. And the way that we've thought about this is this. 5 families of self-control processes that'll be drawn across this developing impulse. And we're going to start with situation selection. So this is, at the very front end, making decisions about the kinds of situations we expose ourselves to with a view to the impact they'll have on the impulses that get generated. That sounds very abstract, but it's not terribly abstract. For example, selecting your physical situation. You sit, and this is a very small auditorium, but if you were in a very big auditorium, it would really make a big difference whether you're seated in the very back where the oxygen levels are low and you can barely see anything happening on stage and you've got banks and banks of computers in front of you, or you're up front and personal. Okay? And this will dramatically determine how likely you are, perhaps, to succumb to the temptation of going way off topic and off task. But also our social situation. I think this is another domain in which we make, and children make, people at all ages make decisions about who to expose ourselves to. Folks on the left or folks on the right. Which is going to be more conducive to the kinds of behaviors that we want to have expressed in our lives. Here are some examples when interviewed high school kids, and Angela will talk in a little bit about some of the studies that we've done. Verbatim suggestions from students who are trying to study. What would you do? What should you do in order to really handle the temptations that you experience when you're studying? Lock myself in a room without my phone so that it doesn't become a distraction. That would fall into exactly the category we're thinking about. I'd go to the library as being in a quiet and controlled environment would make me focus. I don't think they have what used to be called weenie bins here in cross-campus library anymore. This is an artifact of hundreds of years ago, probably. But I will vouch for the fact that, what are they called? They probably called something totally different. Oh, is that right? Okay. No, okay. Sorry, this dates me and us, doesn't it? I apologize. Yeah. All right, but that was a very secure way of fending off my roommate's desperate attempts to have me go have pizza instead of studying when I was here. All right, so let's take the second family of self-control strategies, situation modification. Here, it's not that you're making decisions about which situation to expose yourself to. It's you're in the situation, but you can fiddle with the situation in various important ways, as we saw, for example, with the kid putting the bell further away. I think that would be an example here. One case that comes up again and again, and we struggle with this. I teach Psychology 1, one of my favorite classes to teach. We have that in common. And I see these laptops all over the place, and I struggle every year to figure out what's the best way. This wouldn't be self-control if I did it, but what I'd really like to have happen is the students make good decisions about how to use their laptops. And here we have, I hope this isn't typical, certainly of Stanford or Yale for that matter, this vast array of distractions, which can be silenced, of course, by modifying the situation as appropriate, shutting the laptop. We know empirically that having cookies close by in a glass jar just means you're going to eat a lot more of those cookies, even if you don't want to, than if the jar is not see-through or it's further away. These would be examples of situation modification. Here's what the high school students say. I would shut off my phone and put it under my pillow so it wouldn't be tempted to touch it. Remove all distractions and tell one of my parents I had a big exam, so they'd check in on me and I'd be forced to stay on task. Very interesting mix of self and sort of inducing others. So self-based, self-initiated induction of other support. Attention deployment's the third family of self-control strategies. And you can see we're just moving systematically down this impulse generative line. So we're imagining, as many of the kids exemplified, that if you gate attention, this is going to be a terrifically powerful entry point. And this is why the KIP program has as one of its centerpieces the rule that you pay attention, eyes on the teacher. Terrifically important way of helping kids stay with the program. Here are some examples from high school students. Ease off texting by ignoring my phone. Remind myself that even the most boring classes count towards my GPA, which will affect my future. And in the discussion, we can come to some of these cases, as in the second of these, that are interesting blends, potentially, of some of the categories I'm trying to artificially segment out for you. But for now, we're focusing on the attentional dimension. Fourth family of regulatory processes, cognitive change. Now we're attending to potentially tempting situation, but we're trying to change the way we're thinking about it. We're using these filters, as it were, rose-colored glasses, to transform by cognitively representing the incoming information in a way that biases the action tendencies in favor of the desirable action path and away from the tempting action path. Examples, I would tell myself that if I study for an hour, I can reward myself by playing video games later. Setting goals, breaking the project up into pieces would have, at least in part, some contact with this cognitive change family of self-control. Lastly, response modulation. We saw, I think, some of that, where you just grit your teeth and crush mind with mind. You just try really hard not to ring that bell. Okay, so this is, and some examples from our kids in the high school study. Just deal with it and study. Just do it. I've worked so hard this year for my grades that I don't watch TV anymore. It's no longer a temptation for me. I just focus and get my work done. All right, so what we're going to do now with that is a framework. So this hierarchical goal conception that highlights the difference between the two types of goals that are in tension and the idea that somehow we are engaging processes that modify the relative strength of these two goals. And then a word about how we're thinking about the unfolding of the impulse generative process and the ways you can intervene. And Angela's now going to talk a little bit about some of the implications that flow from this temporal segmentation of strategies and a little bit about some studies we've done to test those.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. Okay, terrific. So I think you have a picture of really two theoretical models. We figured two speakers. We'll just squeeze in two theoretical models. First, a hierarchical way of understanding what does it mean to have a goal that we would call desirable. Well, a goal that's embedded in a structure where really the top of that pyramid is something which is of enduring and personal significance versus these, chocolate cake kind of goals that come and go and aren't really anchored in that way. And the second is this process model. How do impulses come about? And given the information about how they come about, where can we selectively, strategically intervene? So, what are the predictions from such of a theoretical approach? The first one is that impulses in this model are posited to grow or in fact diminish, but nevertheless change over time in terms of their strength. And we can capitalize that. If you think about snowballs running down mountains, if you want to stop a snowball, try to stop it at the top, don't try to stop it at the bottom. So if there is an impulse to eat the chocolate cake, instead of modeling good, healthy behavior to your teenage son and daughter, then better to nip that impulse in the bud, as it were, as opposed to let that impulse flourish and grow, and then at the very last stage, for example, in response modulation, simply just stop yourself from eating it. Secondly, the idea that this earlier intervention, well, I went to that one, so let me move on to then the third one. The idea that temptation-oriented impulses in our model would have a head start is crucial. The metaphor of snowballs rolling down mountains doesn't necessarily get you to the idea that you should go earlier, except for, very importantly, the snowball that is the chocolate cake eating snowball does get a very early start on us, and in fact, we would argue that there are certain automatic means by which these impulses do augment, self-augment over time, whereas our desirable tendencies that are embedded in this pyramidal structure may need more help, actually, in growing in strength. And so if you put this together, the idea is that earlier is better. And what's earlier in our model? The situational strategies. So if you asked me, you know, if a fifth grade teacher wants to help her fifth grade students get more self-controlled, should she tell them to use more willpower, the last stage? I would say, well, that's not a very good idea, but that's what most fifth grade teachers do, right? Just control yourself, for God's sake, is the phrase that comes out of a lot of our mouths when we have nothing else to say. I wouldn't actually even put much stock in the kind of later cognitive strategies of cognitive change and attentional deployment, because there again, the impulses have already grown in strength a fair bit, and just to turn your attention away from the chocolate cake once you've sort of, put yourself close to it, etc., that may not be the smartest thing. What may be the smartest thing to do is actually to choose or change your situation when impulses to do bad things that are enjoyable in the moment are still nascent. And I want to move to an experiment that James and I have run recently with high school students, and actually my lab manager, Alyssa's in the audience. She was the person really running it. James and I were just standing around on the sidelines waving our hands. The idea is quite simple. There were 3 conditions in this experiment. High school students were in one of 3 conditions. In the first condition, they were taught situation modification strategies. We didn't put them through the pain and suffering of the process model, but we simply showed them certain, key empirical findings, like, for example, the study at Cornell that found, indeed, when secretaries were given candy in clear glass jars that were within hand's reach, they ate dramatically more than secretaries randomly assigned to the same candy, but now in jars that were opaque, and which, because they were 6 feet away, required getting out of your seat to actually take one, right? So they were given a little tour of findings suggesting to them that self-control depends a lot on your situation, and therefore you can change your situation in order to exert self-control. So that was one condition, the condition that we expected to do, quote unquote, the best. The second condition was a response modulation condition that simply exhorted these high school students to use willpower. We gave them some YouTube video of TED Talks talking about the importance of self-control and just suppressing impulses when you needed to. So we called that the willpower condition or the response modulation condition. And we expected that potentially to have some effect, as lectures sometimes do, at least in the short run, but not to be as efficacious as the first condition. And the third condition was simply a no treatment control. So it's a 3-arm study, 1-week follow-up. We asked the same students to report on academic goals that they had set during that first session. And in the preliminary findings that I'm going to show you, simply quantified how much these students said that they did in fact accomplish the goals that they had set a week earlier. So we equipped these students with 3 the no treatment has nothing, I guess, and then there's response modulation and situation modification. On the vertical axis, we have self-reported goal accomplishment that 1 week later, and there is a significant difference favoring, the page at Meet with Philosophers, James, is starting at 3 o'clock.
Good, okay, we are disappearing this.
Yes.
And putting this
back
up.
I pushed the wrong button.
There you go.
Yep, there we go. Fairly straightforward, actually, and in a replication study with college students, we replicated the study design exactly, and then you have nearly identical results. In the college sample, we also asked students at 1 week follow-up, over the previous week, how tempting did it feel to actually resist distractions and things that would hinder you in attaining your academic goal? And in fact, we find partial mediation. So we find that those students assigned randomly to the situation modification condition were able to, well, I don't know if to say able to, experienced fewer feelings or less strong feelings of temptation that partially at least explain the effect of situation modification on goal attainment. So I want to say that this is preliminary work. James and I just came from Dean Carlin's office in the economics department where we were talking about replicability and how it's very, very important not to cherry pick your results. And, so we need larger samples. We need independent confirmation that, in fact, situation modification does work. But if it does, I think the questions are really intriguing about, where this research takes us. The take home from this lecture for me, and I would just say that, for the last 3 years of collaborating with Tamar and James, is that our intuitions about self-control may be, in fact, completely the opposite of what science is now telling us may be most effective. When you ask 5th graders, 9th graders, or even 47-year-olds, like, well, what is self-control, and, how should you do it? You often get these kind of Nike slogan, like, well, just do it, or Nancy Reagan, just don't do it. Like, and I think the word just, by the way, is a giveaway that people are not thinking about artful, creative ways, and in fact, ways that would take the effort out of effortful self-control altogether. So we have this intuition that self-control is a mental act, that is something that is, akin to a charioteer trying to control two difficult horses, one difficult horse, the other one, something that is about strife and struggle. And in fact, these kind of very clever things, put the bell a little farther away, turn the cell phone off, don't buy chocolate chip cookies in the first place. These clever little tricks may not be recognizable as self-control, but in fact they are. James and I were not able to identify many journal articles on this topic, but we found an unlimited number of Better House and Gardens, fitday.com, Better You, Self Magazine, essays about these tricks to, for example, exercise more or to eat less. So there are some puzzles and open questions, and just to seed the conversation now, I didn't talk about grit. Nobody ever asked me to talk about self-control, so we capitalized on this invitation to actually talk about self-control and not grit. I actually love talking about grit, but I'll just say that James and I have actually thought long and hard about how grit is and isn't like self-control. We'd be delighted to entertain that question as a group. To what extent are situational strategies, in fact, indirectly intrapsychic strategies? So you could say the first two strategies in the model are about changing the world around you, and the last three are about changing things inside your head. But if you turn off your cell phone so that you don't look at it, so that it doesn't deter you from doing your work, isn't the turning it off, in fact, indirectly intrapsychic because it's operating via attention deployment? So that's emerging thinking, but something that we're eager to pursue. Third, to what extent can a desirable impulse itself become automatic? Now, in one of the quotes that we showed you from a high school student who said, just get on with my work and so forth. I've worked really hard this year, so now, and there's the implication, so now I can just get to my work, and there's the implication that a habit has been formed. And we're really interested in the intersection of habit, an automated desirable response, and self-control as we've discussed it today. We've made the claim that earlier is better in the context of the process model. That works if you're in a cycle of situation flowing to attention, flowing to a cognitive representation to a response. But of course, there's the question of what if you are not within a given cycle, but for example, using cognitive change at a much earlier cycle. So the process model is an iterative one, but if you are in an earlier iteration, but at a later stage in the cycle, can that actually be better than a later cycle, but an earlier stage? So I hope that wasn't complete jargon. My point is that, you know, the idea that you go flowing from situation all the way to response modulation sort of leaves out the important detail that it's a recursive, so that then you have to like go back to, you've modified the situation, now what situation am I in? And the idea that an earlier cycle altogether may trump any kind of like within cycle ordering effects that we've talked about today. And then finally, who or what bears the ultimate responsibility of making these situational tweaks that optimize self-control? Should you be the one to go into Starbucks and say, no, can I have the children's size? I don't even know if they have a small size at Starbucks. I don't think they do. Like, does it behoove you as an individual to do that? Or should there be a tax on extra large lattes with whipped cream and caramel, right? So is it society? Is it the government? Should Pepsi Cola take for some responsibility here? And here's where, for example, our talk on self-control intersects with the work in behavioral economics, in particular, you know, the work of scientists who call this general idea like nudging the consumer towards more desirable behaviors and away from less desirable ones. So we're very interested in you know, all of these questions and challenges. I think the thing to do now is to say thank you very much for your attention, and let's open it up for a bit of Q&A, however long Paul and Tamara say.
So technically we have, let's until 6 o'clock for the lecture, but because we moved downstairs somewhat late, I propose that we run in question and answer until 6:10. Our speakers will then be available at reception for continued conversation. Those of you who need to leave may obviously do so without it being in any way.
Without any offense to the speakers.
Perfect.
Yes,
So
right,
I
yeah.
will let James and Angela field their own
Yeah.
questions.
Great.
And then we'll break at 6:10 to move into a present.
So let's give people a second to leave if they need to, and then we'll start with questions.
And then there's a question in the back there. Look, I could see a hand go up. Yeah, yeah. Motion
I just thought it'd
detection's
be
in order.
cool.
No, it's really good, yeah. Thank you for coming, students. I gave your water away. I hope you don't need it.
That's fine. Please.
So, I'm an experimental biologist, not a psychologist, and I have 3 grown-up children. This is the experience. The question is, from what I understand, desperately reading about the teenager's mind, that the ability to self-control is formed by about 21 years old. I would have 5 years with respect to my children. Right? So, what sense does it make to study self-control on individuals who have not developed this feeling? It's like studying, contraception. And the second part is, it seems what you described is wonderfully logical, but in this case, I just asked about how my mind works. I wish it would work so logically, but it doesn't. Probably as many other people's minds. So, to what extent self-control is actually logical? And from what from popular literature that we make decisions before we actually know we make decisions. So, to what extent these experiments that we describe are actually related to life in general?
Great.
Beyond a piece of cake outside of the picture.
Okay, now the funny part becomes, so there were a
Yeah.
lot of questions.
I know, right? Which were the...
Do you want to do the do you want to
Yeah.
do the why study kids?
Yeah, and
what
I
can
think
we-
you said that you've heard that self-control stops developing at what age? I didn't catch that. But
21 plus 5.
Oh, 21 plus 5. Okay, I didn't catch that. Okay. So adolescence is a particularly interesting phase of life in which to study self-control, in part because not everyone, but many psychologists believe 2 things are actually happening in adolescence. We have this gradually increasing competence, this gradually increasing capacity to, for example, modulate responses, like in the last stage of the process model, just using the front part of the brain, right, to do that, or potentially through increasing sophistication with strategies that we've talked about, right? But nevertheless, as you get older, getting better at that part of the, the equation. But in adolescence, there's this spike in the strength, the intensity of impulses themselves. So you might be gradually from childhood through adolescence into early adulthood and even middle adulthood get gradually more sophisticated and better at regulating impulses, but you have to also account for the spike in the strength of the impulses. And it's being called the perfect storm, that in adolescence you have still emerging, still developing control in combination with terribly powerful impulses to do risky things, try things that are exciting, even if they're dangerous, break rules, et cetera. And because of that, adolescents actually get into more trouble, either than young adults or get into more trouble than kids who are like 10, right? Which, you have to sort of explain this kind of peak that happens right there. So adolescence is interesting. I don't know that there is actually strong evidence that you're set like plaster by the time you're 30 years old, which was one idea that prevailed in psychology for a long time. I think the consensus is that there may be differing levels of plasticity and change throughout the life course, but there always is plasticity and change throughout the life course. So it's good to show up at a lecture like this, even if you're past the age of 21 plus 5 or whatever the figure was. So that's the adolescence piece of it. Do you want to handle the non-conscious processes and self-control or the ecological validity question?
Sure. I mean, yeah. I'll have a good. These are great questions.
Yeah, really
so
great.
Let's just sort of think together. So with Angela, I think I would say that on the first of the two questions, we can learn a lot, I think, by studying even immature, organisms, because we're interested in the processes that will support not only their functioning but also subsequent functioning. And there are a number of strategies that psychologists and other scientists have, of course, as you know very well, in looking at organisms as they develop to see what order capacities come online, what the stress points are, but then also as organisms mature, what contexts are there that actually suppress optimal performance versus enhance optimal performance. So I think for me that's a recipe for looking at the full range of functioning from immature organisms all the way through actually late adulthood. There's very interesting evidence to my mind in the domain, talked about self-control in general. One special case is emotion control. And in that special domain, there's actually, I think, very compelling evidence that even until very late in adulthood, people are getting, in some ways, better and better at regulating their emotions. And so this is well beyond 21 plus 5. This is into 160s and 70s and beyond sometimes. Greater use of some of these more sophisticated strategies, even as the machinery that's enabling this, some of these prefrontal circuits, are being degraded with age. So that's, I think, call for being interested in really the full range of variation, both age, certainly culture, which we've not emphasized, but also intactness of functioning. I think all of this is telling us something about the underlying processes. With respect to the second of the two questions, as I understood it, there are a number of interesting parts to that. I think we've tried to express at a very first level approximation sort of a framework that we're thinking is useful in sorting out the chaos of this field. So if you look in either the full field of self-control in psychology and humanities more generally, or if you look in emotion regulation as a subfield, it's just chaotic. It has been chaotic. And so what we're trying to do is, I think, offer a very simple framework for beginning to think about processes and how they can be integrated. We're not making the claim, and I apologize if it sounded as though we're making the claim, that this is necessarily how people themselves think about what they're doing. Right? So we want to distinguish between the kinds of entry points that might be available given what we think are the, in this case, psychological steps that go into impulse generation. We're also, I think, I'm certainly very interested in my lab in understanding the neurobiological bases of these different steps. Done a lot of work on cognitive change in particular. What are the systems that enable that form of regulation? So I think we're interested in the processes and organizing points of intervention, but make no claims that this isn't very straightforward as a way of thinking about this in naive psychology. I think it does make some contact with naive psychology, but I think that's for me that's a separate case. And I'm not sure that I would want to rely entirely on someone's introspections about sort of what works best for just the reasons Angela said. You know, we have plenty of people saying just do it or just don't do it, or, you know, a lot of confusion about the many things that might work. And what we're trying to do is to apply the scientific method to these age-old problems. Plato, of course, wasn't himself the first in the Western tradition, and in each of the world traditions, this has been a centerpiece of discussion. So that's the first approximation to your two questions. You had a question a moment ago. Was that rendered irrelevant by the other discussion?
I'm interested in the social component. A lot of times, somebody else was buying the cookies, or hands you something, or whatever. Well, it's that, you know, your roommate. How do you think about that? Obviously, that's going to be much more hard to study, but what about the fact that our environments are always inevitably social?
Do you want to say something?
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea that there are these social forces that are usually thought of as forces beyond your control, right? Your roommate comes home and says, we're all going to, I guess it used to be Naples, whatever they go out to now. And, you know, you didn't want that to happen. You couldn't predict that that would happen, but then it happened, right? So, so there's that element of social forces, but I think there's also at least some wiggle room, right, for you to proactively direct social forces in the way that you want it to be directed. So for example, there was this little picture of, you know, kids drinking on a brick wall and then like studious kids, I don't know, like playing violin or getting ready for like SAT prep or something like that. And, you know, the inspiration for that actually is I did a focus group with 10th and 5th graders in the Bronx, New York, very low income area. And a very wizened 10-year-old was saying, 10th grader was saying to a 5th grader from the same school population, you know, if I only knew at your age what I have learned now at the age of like 16, I would have gotten into a different crowd, because once you know, hang out with certain kids, you start to do what they do, and it was really hard for me to, you know, actually pull myself out of it. So I think to some extent there were degrees of freedom for that. Not easy, right? But there's some way that you can try to manipulate your social circumstances to advantage. You know, whether that be, you know, telling your roommates like, stop doing that, I'm trying, you know, like, or finding different kinds of friends to hang out with. So not an easy question, but I think that assuming that social forces are outside of the bounds of self-control actually might be an incomplete way of thinking about it.
Yeah, I'm gonna agree.
Yeah, okay.
So you were wondering about whether desired responses could become automated. And so the way I was thinking about that was that when people have certain habits, we tend to give them a label, a trait for that characteristic. So I'm wondering if the label of principled is a coherent concept, because if it is, then it might attach to certain people who across different domains have self-control. So is there any psychological study about principled people and what being principled correlates to?
It's interesting. You want to try? Okay, I'll go. Yeah.
Why
so
don't you go, 'cause, I mean,
domain
that links nicely
specificity.
Yeah, and then go to grit. I mean.
Okay, so yeah, all right, I'll pull out grit as a, okay, so super interesting question. So first of all, I should say that I had a graduate student named Eli who came to me and very soon in his research with me became really interested in the extent to which, like Tiger Woods or certain politicians, the list goes on and on, there was the demonstration of extraordinary self-control across a wide range of life domains, and yet in one, a certain failing, right? So, you know, these tend to make headlines. You're like, really? Like, and in particular because, you know, for example, Sports Illustrated ran an entire feature story on Tiger Woods not very long before he got into a lot of trouble about how he was a paragon of self-discipline across every domain in his life, from finance to, you know, what he put in his mouth to when he woke up in the morning, and et cetera. So, so I think first of all I should just acknowledge that human beings are, as Michel de Montaigne said in his essays in the 16th century, we are more unlike ourselves than we are unlike other people. In other words, there can be tremendous variation in the extent to which we are, you know, self-controlled in one domain and impulsive in another. Now, you wanted to point out that maybe some people actually were fairly self-controlled across domains. Him, like he's no vices. And I do think there's the, you know, certainly that could be true, and certainly, I mean, I know a little bit about this. There are research areas where they will document that, for example, it's not only true that some people are more emotionally regulated than others, but some people are just more consistent across the domains of their life, right? So consistently dysregulated or consistently regulated. And I think you can put a name to it, and you can call it principled, or actually in the psychoanalytic tradition, I think this used to be called what someone was integrated, an integrated personality was someone who had a coherence across the many domains of their life. So yes, there's domain specificity, but not all of us are at quite as irregular in our profiles as people like Tiger Woods. And maybe those of us who have more consistency in a desirable way, we could call principled. And maybe, I guess you could say that, that starts to then border on my notion of grit, which is that you have a superordinate goal that really organizes everything else in your life, and then there's tremendous consistency in that everything that you do in your waking and sometimes your sleeping hours is goal congruent to that higher order goal.
One challenge, just in terms of the connotative range, when you talk about principled, that sort of sounds good. But I don't think there's anything in what Angela just said that says that these superordinate goals are goals that others would endorse. Right? So let's not speculate, but you or others might have just these really toxic goals that you're very, very disciplined about, and right? And that we're not, to say that yes, there's a sense in which you can say you're a principled person to aspire to killing everybody in sight, but there's a sort of oddness to that. So I do think, but I very much endorse what Angela said. So we are just at the time you said we're turning into pumpkins. Should we stop at this point?
I think so. One of the things we like to do at Yale is to give people the opportunity to put theory into practice. And so I'd like to offer you the opportunity to